You might say that I've lived a rather sheltered life. I don't get out much. My life has been quiet and uneventful for the most part. Most of my days have been spent alone, praying, meditating, writing poetry, making music, and worshiping the Lord. I still remember the first time that I heard someone curse the name of God. I was shaken to my core. My life would never be the same. But before I tell you about that fateful day, lest you think that I am just lazy, pampered, spoiled, with too much time on my hands, perhaps I should mention that I do have a job. It is a thankless occupation, but I enjoy it very much. You see, I am a shepherd. I have also recently picked up some part-time work playing my harp to soothe King Saul and singing songs like this. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Now back to the day when I first heard the holy name of Yahweh cursed instead of worshiped. It was on this day that my own life shifted from green pastures and quiet waters to a path which seemed scary and uncertain. My faith in the Good Shepherd would be put to the test. For years, we Israelites had fought against the Philistines. Well, mostly we just hid in caves to get away from the Philistines, with the exception of a few short-lived and scattered victories. They were real bullies and were never up for a fair fight. They had disarmed us of any weapons of warfare with which to defend ourselves. They possessed the only men of the blacksmith trade, and they charged our people burdensome amounts of money for their services. We were only allowed to get agricultural tools fashioned, even at such a high price. The heat was on once again with the Philistines, and my 3 eldest brothers were all fighting in Israel's army under the command of King Saul. I was too young to be enlisted with the troops. Father was getting worried about my brothers since we had not heard a word from them for nearly 6 weeks. He sent me out to the battlefield to check on them and take them some food and provisions. I ran to the battlefield, trying hard not to step in the fertilizer that my sheep had left behind as they ate the grain stubble from the fields. When I stopped to catch my breath, I could not believe my ears. It was the voice of a towering giant, over 9 feet tall, standing in the valley between the 2 armies and cursing the holy name of Yahweh. Why had nobody taken him down already? He had to be stopped. He had gotten closer and closer to our army with each passing day. For 40 days, he presented this one-on-one, winner-take-all challenge. I suppose most of the men had hoped that if they just ignored this problem, that it would simply go away. But instead, it became more imminent, as problems usually do. Even the reward that King Saul had put out to anyone who could defeat this giant was not enough to entice a man to come forward to fight him. The king's daughter in marriage and freedom from taxes for the whole family seemed pretty good to me. For some reason, I seemed to be the only one concerned about the reward for victory. Everyone else had their gaze set upon defeat. Perhaps it was because they were only Saul's soldiers, and they only looked to his leadership. They had forgotten that Yahweh was their true king, and that they were really soldiers in his army. My oldest brother Eliab heard me asking about the reward and scolded me harshly. I guess he was still sore because Samuel had passed him over when he came to our house that day looking for Israel's next king, and he anointed me instead. It was as if he had a war going on within himself. I had to focus on what was important. If I would have stayed around and wasted my time squabbling with Eliab, I would have never made it to Goliath. Word got to King Saul of my inquiry on the battlefield, so he sent for me. Now, before you criticize Saul for not being the courageous leader he should have been in fighting this battle himself, consider this. Saul had made his share of mistakes already during his reign, but he was still smart enough to know that this battle was really between Yahweh and the gods of the Philistines. Saul had fought battles time and time again in the past on his own, and he knew how poorly they had ended. He had been told by the prophet Samuel that since he had rebelled against God so many times, he would not have a dynasty and his kingdom would end with him. He sadly no longer had God's favor, spirit, and protection. Saul knew he didn't have a chance against Goliath without God's help. He could have died valiantly in battle, which he would have rather done than to live in dishonor. But then the entire nation of Israel would have fallen into enemy hands. We would have been made slaves, our men turned to eunuchs, and the promises of God to Abraham concerning his seed would have come to naught. Even the very promised plan of redemption would have been abolished. No, Saul was not a coward for staying out of this fight. Swallowing his pride and staying at home was probably the bravest thing he had ever done. The king had good intentions in offering me his armor, being as how it was the best battle protection that existed in all of Israel. I don't think he liked it too well when I refused his suggestion. I meant no disrespect. It wasn't the right fit for me. It weighed me down too much to run, and now was certainly not the time to experiment, since it would mean either life or death. All right. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I explained my logic to the king to fight Goliath with only my simple shepherd's gear. I told him about the lion and the bear that I had killed with God's help when they came after my flock. This giant had dared to come against the flock of Israel, and I knew he would be no different. I was good with the sling, being as how I had plenty of time to practice on the hillside when I wasn't playing my harp or writing poetry. I also knew where to get the smoothest and densest stones that were both lethal and accurate. I'm sure I shocked some by breaking the custom of making a big show of donning an impressive armor, especially before going into a battle like this one. But I had nothing to prove of myself. I knew that God would show up and show out. Right. This was his battle. Yeah. Goliath was insulted to see me walk out onto the battlefield to accept his challenge. After taunting my size, youth, and seemingly inadequate weaponry, he began to curse me by his gods. I couldn't help but chuckle when he cursed me by the name of Dagon. It reminded me of some years ago when the Philistines had captured the Ark of the Covenant that we so often carried into battle with us, which symbolized God's presence. That was the Philistines' first mistake, thinking that they could keep God in a box. They sat Dagon up by the ark of God, and by the next morning, Dagon had fallen down with his face to the ground. They sat him up again the next morning, and Dagon had fallen down again with his head cut off. I thought to myself, I know how this is going to turn out. He wanted me to come to him, so that Goliath could fight the hand-to-hand combat that he knew so well. Why should I come to him and ensure my death when he obviously could not come to me? I refused to fight the enemy on his terms. If I was going to win, I had to change the rules of the game. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. At that moment, I was overwhelmed. Maybe it was anointing or adrenaline, or maybe I was just too stupid to be afraid, or maybe even a mix of all of those. But I ran toward the giant. I put a stone in my sling and aimed straight for his forehead. Had he had his head down in concentration on the battle, his helmet was designed to protect him. But since he had his head reared back in laughter, it left his whole forehead unprotected. The stone sunk into Goliath's forehead, and he fell face down to the ground with a great big thud. I had no sword in my hand, so I quickly ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath, and I got it out, and it was so heavy that I had to make sure not to drop it and cut off my own feet as I pulled it up and cut Goliath's head off and finished the job. The tables had turned, and now the Philistines were running in fear. We won a great victory that day, and our entire nation was saved from slavery. I put Goliath's armor in my tent as a daily reminder of his deliverance. Women were singing in the streets, and I enjoyed a brief moment of fame. The Philistines did not make good on their promise to be our slaves after the defeat of their champion. Neither did Saul give me his eldest daughter in marriage, but gave her to another man. As for the taxes, I guess we'll have to wait and see how that turns out. Doing what is right in the eyes of God and having his favor is reward enough, in spite of the reality that we will not always receive praise from men. Neither can we expect men to make good on their promises as God always does. I did what I had to do, and I still have no regrets. Well, I have to run back now and get to my sheep. I'm not sure where the future will take me now, but I know that things will never be the same. I can be sure of this one thing. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever.